We originally released this video last year and it was one of our worst performing videos because it got age restricted for reasons. Apparently we showed violence, we didn't. Apparently it was not appropriate for children, it was. Apparently taking an overtly anti-colonial position on YouTube.com can impact the amount of people who see your video, even if you're white. So this time we're going to play the game and be very well behaved. And given that a few months have passed in which time the UK government has changed prime ministers 3 times, tanked their economy and threatens to split the union with an undemocratic expression of hardcore right-wing transphobia, we're also going to relate all of this to contemporary politics. So what is Northern Ireland? Controversial? To say anything more than that, we're going to need to take a look into the deep past. Okay, Google. What is Northern Ireland? Ooh. Is it bad? Is it good? Is it dangerous? Is it a tourist destination? Is it a war zone? Does it even exist? I guess we'll have to go and find out. Get back here, Margaret Thatcher! Northern Ireland is this part of Ireland, and depending on who you ask, it's either a country or a province or a region or a territory or some other thing. And when I say that depending on who you ask, I mean quite literally, at least 2 of those definitions, country and province, actually come from the same source, the website of the Office of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Bojo Horseman. I mean, Liz, trustworthy. I mean, rich boy. The UK tends to decide what Northern Ireland is in any given situation depending on its own political agenda. But we can cut through all of that ambiguity. After all, the Oxford English Dictionary defines a country as an area of land that has, or used to have, its own government and laws. What? That didn't help any. You see, this is the problem. Most people are using words with this vague and diffuse meaning. They're relying on inferring meaning from usage. Academic terminology can be so hyper-specific and forbidding that it's its own kind of unhelpful, and political terminology, words like conflict, growth, refugee, Northern Ireland, they have their meaning decided upon for political purposes. Now I can pause here and say that the people who write dictionaries are the first to admit the limitations and problems of relying on the dictionary as a source of immutable and objective truth. What dictionaries are is fluid and descriptive reflections of the way people use words. So the next time you're asking philosophical questions and citing research in order to come to some conclusion about the world, and somebody says, well, actually, the dictionary says that, no. Because essentially what they're doing is saying this one sentence based on popular opinion says that, for example, a woman is a human female. Because that didn't actually clear anything up, did it? At which point the dictionary people say, well, sorry about that, I really have to go. A rare new word has just been spotted in...
Oh, drive it up.
Slight right to continue on.
Neil, why does your tone sound like Margaret Thatcher?
I don't know, Sarah, my phone's been up weird. It's
Second
weird.
exit for Drogheda.
It's pronounced Drogheda, Thatcher, Drogheda. God, getting the English-speaking world to respect Irish phonology is like trying to get them to respect a pronoun. Ireland is a tribal place. People from County Cork might think of themselves as a different people to the rest of the country, particularly to those from Dublin. And there are some people from Dublin who haven't even heard of County Cork, but who will laugh at you if you don't know where Jervis Street is. And there are at least 3 dialects of our native language, Gaeilge, Irish. And all of this is borne out in a map of diverse accents and dispositions, which can mean that people from one mountain might not get on with or even be able to understand people from the next mountain over. In a geography sometimes spanning only tens of kilometers, Irish people have a cultural diversity that is, like everything else in this essay, difficult to define. And you might be thinking, well, that's a little like the UK. No! Because the United Kingdom is a kingdom at the heart of a dying empire, the very definition of which relies explicitly on the conquest of other countries. That's cultural hegemony that arises from very different factors. We must protect the Union. If Liz was merely Her Royal Highness the Queen of London, then maybe, yeah, that might be quaint. But she's not. She's
Dead now.
Queen Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom.
It's now His Majesty Charles III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom, Canada, and his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of
Faith, fuck me, that's pretentious. But what does pretentious mean? No, it's just that Queen Elizabeth II, by definition, can't be pretentious because she's important. Whereas me, I'm working class with barely a qualification from a technical institute, so everything I try to say is pretentious. This is the trouble with words. Ireland, in its tribalism and cultural ambiguity, should perhaps instead be thought of as similar to Scotland, similar to Yorkshire, to the West Country, to cultural bits of the United Kingdom. Nothing wrong with those, they're very pretty cultures. Go and have a pint of real ale in a pub as old as Shakespeare, and then come at me with your anti-British sentiment. I know, but I wasn't being there is a difference between the people of Britain and the machine of Britain. They're cool people. I like them. Indigenous cultural diversity in Europe is cool, and not just in the Hibernian archipelago, but in lots of parts of Europe. There are all these indigenous languages and cultures with their own separatist movements, like the Basques, the Bretons, the Provençals, the Corsicans, the Flemings, and that's pretty much just France, or people living under the imposed identity of French. Historically, ethnic groups only became part of hegemonic cultures through violence. Empires start in cities and invade their neighbours first, and it's fair for people to not like that. Or, for example, in Ireland, we have our own indigenous itinerant population, Irish travellers. And you know what? We're so gruesomely fucking racist towards them that would actually have to be its own separate video. But you see, you understand, ethnic diversity, it's cool, it should be beautiful, but under our current political system, it is little more than an inconvenience. In the Republic of Ireland, we can sort of smush and oversimplify all of that cultural diversity into one meta-identity, Irishness, redefined in having cast off the shackles of the imposed identity of Britishness and all of the ugliness of British rule, which we'll get to. Irishness now, that identity, is a much better fit than the imposed identity of Britishness, in the Republic at least. And mostly people are pretty happy with it. It doesn't lead to cultural dissonance. It doesn't lead to violence. But up the road, where we're headed, in the north, there are people who are ethnically and ancestrally Scottish and Northern English. Ulster Scots, for the longest time, who knows how long. But it is a legitimate cultural heritage. There were more plantations up there too, during the colonisation of Ireland. Wealthy, aristocratic, landowning British families were planted, concentrated in the north, to the extent that British identifying Protestants still make up a relative majority of the population up there. There were more Protestant churches, there was more infrastructure, a concerted effort to build a little Britain. And there was that old trick the Empire liked to pull. Absolutely devastate a place. Leave it so that there's no reasonable way to govern it. Fill it up with whoever you'd like to fill it up with. And then in the middle of the madness and the smoke and the tears and the blood and the bullets and the bombs, at some point in the 20th century, turn around and say, why are you being so violent? Don't you want to come to some sort of compromise? And so the land was partitioned. The Republic down south and Northern Ireland up top, and it didn't really matter if it was a country or a province or a region or a wizard, as long as it was theirs. Cultural complexity smushed and oversimplified against the will of the majority population of the island into a territory. It's not the people's fault that such was the desire to make a queen's name longer. And that, my friends, of all of the explanations you'll ever hear about Northern Ireland, is the most unpretentious. But we're not going there to fix it. We're not going to fix anything. We're going there to better understand how discourse shapes reality, how political definitions, words like country, refugee, war, terrorist, immigrant, are designed to be a certain way. They, unlike the dictionary, don't reflect our reality, they shape it. And in order to do that, we have to ask, what exactly is a Northern Ireland? "1921, the World Series is first broadcast on American radio, breaking through their usual diet of swing, jazz, and racist propaganda. In Europe, it's the interwar period between the war to end all wars and the other war to end all wars. It's an interesting time in European politics, the rise of fascism, baby. And meanwhile, in Russia, the new economic policy is being developed by a swinging young hip cat by the name of Vladimir Lenin." Things could have gone so many ways. And here, in Ireland, we're in the midst of the Irish War of Independence. We're in a liminal state between independence proper and being part of the British Empire. So a breakaway government has formed, Dáil Éireann, but also we're under martial law, and British armed forces roam the entire island. That would be the British Army and the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC, and they are embroiled in a bitter, brutal, bloody, thorn-in-their-side conflict with the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army, a guerrilla army of volunteers charged with the task of getting rid of the British, which, as you can imagine, is an uphill struggle. Half of the infrastructure is British and half of the infrastructure is Irish. People are divided across the politics, yes, and across religions and across identities, but also across class divides, because just like now, many's the political pragmatist who could give two shits about who has the right to rule as long as they have their own personal wealth and security and status. And just like now, many's the political pragmatist who could give less than two shits about what the country is called as long as they can unionize against their employer and have a bit of a socialism. And you might argue, why try to get rid of the British at all? Well, when the Americans did it, it was because there was no representation and there was taxation. And oh boy, do you Americans have your feelings about taxation. Here in Ireland, it was exacerbated by the events between 1845 and 1855, the Great Irish Famine, or as I like to call it, the time the British stole all the food. And it is uncontroversial to say that the British Empire was responsible for the deaths of millions of Irish people. Besides which, the conditions surrounding the famine had persisted plenty into the 20th century, with British landlords, this enormous wealth inequality, police and state brutality, and the destruction of Irish culture and the Irish language. Plus, if it's nothing else, you could just say what Winston Churchill said: "We've always found the Irish quite odd. They refuse to be English."
You're taking him out of context.
Anyway, that's a lot of preamble. But Irish history is full of these needlessly complex explanations for conflict and retaliation against the British. And by rights, we shouldn't have to explain any of it, except that the closer to the present you get, the more vague and messy the ideologies become. And you have to be careful about who gets blamed for the conflict and who gets the credit for the peace. In fact, you have to be careful about what the words conflict and peace even mean. Just keep an eye on all the words. All the words floating around back there, you see them, keep an eye on them. Watch as they change over time. So anyway, the summer of 1921, the IRA capture and burn down the Customs House, the seat of the local government Board of Ireland under British rule. And even though 5 IRA men are killed and 80 IRA men are captured, adding to an increasingly ridiculous number of captured IRA volunteers, still, it is a decisive victory in terms of the spirit of the thing. There is a sense that the tide is turning, that the end of British rule is in sight. It's funny, the British like to claim that the Battle of Hastings in 1066 was the last time the British were defeated on their own soil. But I would argue that they were defeated a lot more recently than that. It's just that because of that defeat, it stopped being British soil and became Irish soil once again. But okay. The conflict ends somewhere around July 1921, and negotiations begin that will turn into the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And boom, Ireland is truly independent, except for the 6 counties in the north, where the majority, who are British identifying unionists, vote against home rule in the first instance and then ultimately independence over and over again. And anyway, they're already partitioned into their own territory called Northern Ireland. See, it already existed. It already existed. I'm fucking explaining anything.
In 100
Shut up, Thatcher.
meters,
Shit.
Continue straight.
Okay, 1920. Because the Irish are waging the War of Independence, there's a lot of bloodshed on both sides. There's attacks on British forces by the IRA, there are attacks on infrastructure, lots of civilian casualties, as well as atrocities committed by the British forces, like Bloody Sunday 1920, in which RIC men, specifically unemployed British soldiers sent over after World War I, with their trauma and their night terrors and their little black and tan uniforms, these just the worst plan. They raided a game of Gaelic football in Croke Park in trucks and armored cars with families and children in attendance. Ostensibly, they're there to scupper an IRA plot, but they opened fire unexpectedly on the crowd, killing 14 and wounding 60 others. And that was far from the only atrocity committed by the Black and Tans during that time. The brainchild, I might add, of one Winston bloody fucking Churchill. Anyway, the point is that Britain had a pretty messy Ireland on their hands at this point. There really was the chance of civil war. Because like I said, there were class divides, and there were people who just wanted the IRA to stop, because then the police would be nice, and the British Army would be nice, wouldn't they? And there was this whole socio-ethnic cohort in this northerly part of the country who, as far as they were concerned, were simply British. So what does one do? Well, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George decides to do a Lin-Manuel Miranda and put an act together. Oh, and what an act it was. He called it the Government of Ireland Act. And it partitioned the island into 2 states, Northern Ireland and
Southern Ireland.
Yes, but in 1921, we became the Republic of Ireland with the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, with Northern Ireland getting 1 month to decide whether or not they wanted to be British or if they wanted to be Irish. I think they're still making up their minds.
Oh, Neil, is there someone looking for a ride?
Oh, yeah. Let's see where he's gone.
Continue straight.
Shut up, Thatcher. I'm just being kind to so many old bastards.
Kilometers.
Hey, where are you headed there, buddy?
Who's so who?
Oh, what a coincidence. So are we. Come on in.
Come on. So, could you do the school?
It's a video essay.
So, for Jordan Peterson?
No, actually, it's about...
Sorry to do this. Can we do this in dubs rather than subtitles? I get car sick when I'm reading.
Fiber fucking be.
No problem.
So it's actually about Northern Ireland, and really it's about how discourse shapes reality.
Go homeland.
Absolutely. And nowhere is this more evident than in the occupied 6 counties known internationally as Northern Ireland. Isn't it interesting that the most northern part of Ireland, Malin Head, is in Donegal?
Or in Southern Ireland, where Jerusalem.
So the northern tip of our country is apparently Southern Ireland. The term Northern Ireland is actually quite misleading. Now, some may suggest that Northern Ireland is just an indicator that it's the northern province of Ireland, Ulster. But as we know, the statelet known as Northern Ireland only includes 6 out of the 9 counties of Ulster, while the remaining 3 counties of Ulster belong to Southern Ireland, or the so-called Republic of Ireland. So what's this all about? Why do we have this geographically incorrect distinction between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland?
Sure, me card go geographer.
Why does the 6-county statelet exist in the first place? To put it bluntly, its creation was a blatant British land grab. You see, after hundreds of years of English and then British colonial domination, in the early 20th century there was a rising tide of mass support for the anti-colonial Irish Republican movement. We see this indicated in the 1918 Irish general election results, in which the entire 32 counties, in our one and only democratic expression as a united people to this day, voted overwhelmingly in favour of the socialistic Irish Republic proclaimed in 1916 and then established in January 1919. Against this backdrop of support across the country for national liberation, the boundaries of the 6 counties were drawn by Britain specifically to cordon off one section of the island that they believed they could maintain in perpetuity to retain a colonial foothold on the island. And the reason they could maintain these particular 6 counties was that, as a result of the hugely successful Ulster plantation of the 1600s, there was enough of a settler-coloniser majority in these counties that loyalty to the British Crown, see Loyalists, would be ensured for the foreseeable future. Thus, against the express will of the entire Irish people indicated in the 1918 general election, British partition of the country occurred in 1921 to 1922, supported by the collaboration of the counter-revolutionary forces of the pro-treaty, pro-imperialist Irish Free State. British partition of this island created not one, but 2 carnivals of reaction, north and south of the colonial border. And from that moment on, British imperialism would no longer speak of one whole united 32-county Ireland, but rather the 6-county Northern Ireland and 26-county Southern Ireland, with the former remaining a direct British colony and the latter becoming a nominally politically independent territory, but in reality a 26-county semi-colony. Usage of the term Northern Ireland to describe the 6-county statelet in the northeast of the country, a British imperialist creation which flew in the face of the overwhelming democratic mandate given by the people of the 32 counties in 1918, is part of a process of normalisation of the continued colonial occupation of the 6 counties by Britain. Promotion of this name, the demarcation of the directly occupied territory from the rest of the country, is a key aspect of the colonial superstructure's ideology which seeks to legitimise the ongoing colonial domination and exploitation of this country by British imperialism.
Tá idealiacht an fórstructúr a chruidiant agad, agus a thugan údar le fórlawas agus dúsíru leanana na héireann ag imperla has na Bratainine.
And for us to accept and use this name, Northern Ireland, as though it truly is a separate entity to the rest of Ireland, is us doing our colonial masters' work for them. But once we shatter the imperialist illusion and call it what it truly is, a colony, this opens up new avenues for political movement. The anti-colonial struggle once again returns to the agenda, and this brings with it the hitherto concealed potential for genuine liberation of the entire people of this country from imperialist domination. The potential for us to finally complete the unfinished revolution and realise the 32-county People's Republic declared in 1916, voted for by the overwhelming majority of the population in 1918, and described in detail in the 1919 Democratic Programme.
Right.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
Careful, Sarah, this is actually hardcore republicanism.
For now, we live in a world that was written by the British. Conversations about liberation became conversations about peace. Conversations about anti-colonial freedom fighters became conversations about a terrorist organisation. And slowly but surely, the British role in centuries of state terrorist violence was pushed out of the narrative. Even when they mercilessly fired on peaceful protesters in Derry in 1972 and killed 14 innocent people, most of whom were trying to rescue those who were fired upon. Bloody Sunday.
The other Bloody Sunday, there's been a lot of blood.
Bloody Sunday became Good Friday, and the Liberal Tony Blair took all the credit for ending the violence, when it was the Liberal British government that had created so-called Northern Ireland in the first place.
I should pause here and explain the Good Friday Agreement, shouldn't I? Alright, more Northern Irish stuff. The Good Friday Agreement was a pair of agreements signed by the then leaders of Ireland and the UK to end the violence in Northern Ireland between the IRA and the British Armed Forces, between the British identifying Protestants and the Irish identifying Catholics. So it was like, in part, a product of desperation on behalf of both countries, but let's face it, it wasn't a coincidence that it happened during a time of real economic prosperity for both Ireland and the UK, when the seeds of neoliberalism were really bearing fruit. So like trading, borrowing, traveling, and investing in one another had become a lot more important than anyone's identity. The Good Friday Agreement defined the terms of power sharing in Northern Ireland across Republican and Unionist representatives, but also, frankly, it was a sweetheart deal for British and Irish businesses.
Conversations about right and wrong, about self-determination and imperialist oppression became little more than conversations about good and bad for business.
At the next roundabout...
Well, send Margaret fucking Thatcher!
Okay, so you reckon there?
Yeah.
Alright.
So if you cross right here, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I think this is
The border between Ireland and Britain. Seems pretty innocuous, actually. Ireland. Britain. Ireland. Britain. You can buy fireworks. Well, this is a lot of fun, but actually, it's horrible. Oh no. Ireland. Well, this is a lot of fun, but actually, it's horrible. This border was drawn like this. What are we doing?
Treaty that sealed Northern Ireland as the ambiguous political entity it remains to this day also sealed the fate of one of its signatories, Michael Collins, who was a revolutionary. He was the Minister for Finance, and he was one of the representatives of the Irish state during treaty negotiations. There was a famous exchange between he and Lord Birkenhead, a conservative British MP, staunch opponent to the Irish nationalist movement, and close personal friend of one Winston bloody fucking Churchill, in which Birkenhead said, "Mr. Collins, by signing this treaty, I am signing my political death warrant." To which Collins replied, "Lord Birkenhead, I'm signing my actual death warrant." Not long after, Michael Collins was murdered by anti-treaty IRA forces. If you ask a Republican, they'll say there's no compromise to be gained. Collins was wrong to sign the treaty. It always should have been an all-island republic. If you ask a Unionist, they're never going to imagine that Northern Ireland shouldn't be part of Britain. In fact, further than that, they probably think that Ireland should be part of Britain. And this ambiguity and dissonance has a knock-on effect globally, where if somebody doesn't know a lot about Ireland, one of the few things they'll think they know is that, oh, it's part of Britain, right? No. Townlands, farms, families felt the stroke of that pen as it tore one state from the other. And the capital of the North, Belfast, would be in an irreconcilable state of war for decades.
It's so cool. The architecture and the murals and that statue just there.
I was trying to actually establish a dark and ominous tone here, Sarah.
Okay, I know, but it's actually really cool. Hi, I love your city.
So the Troubles, or the Northern Irish conflict, was a low-level war that took place on the streets of Belfast and Derry.
You mean Londonderry?
Don't you start! Derry! And into Northern Ireland beyond that, and into the Republic and even the United Kingdom. There was conflict all over the place. It took place from about 1960 to, roughly speaking, 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, I can say here that there were parts of Northern Ireland you could live in and live a perfectly peaceful and relatively normal life, even during this time, with, again, people living on one side of the mountain having a very different lived experience to people living on the other side of the mountain. kind of impossible to do justice to what life was like in this place at that time. There were IRA bombs going off, kidnappings, the British Army roamed the streets, there were organised mobs of unionists like the Shankill Defence Force burning down Catholic businesses and torturing people and facing no consequences from the unionist police force. It was normal to have an army helicopter land in your back garden, to have your school bus searched for bombs, to have bullets flying in the air for decades. Horrific acts of violence were normal, like the IRA bombing in Omagh, where a splinter group of the IRA detonated a bomb because they didn't like the Good Friday Agreement, and they killed 29 people and injured 220 others. I actually remember that. I was 9 years old. Those of you who've seen the Netflix series The Crown may remember that one episode where they mention Ireland. Lord Louis Mountbatten, played by Tywin Lannister, was blown up by the IRA in 1979, definitely for no reason whatsoever, except that now maybe you understand some of the reasons. And also, this was the guy who drew the line across India and Pakistan while he was empiring. Who the fuck gave Britain the... I can't be objective. I could frame him as a father whose legs were blown off by terrorists before he bled to death. Or I could frame him as a colonizer who was holidaying and lobster potting off the coast of my country 12 miles from an active war zone when somebody decided to teach his objectively evil and racist family a lesson. And if you watch The Crown, they'll frame it one way. If you rely on British textbooks, they'll frame it another. The discourse you engage in will frame your reality. So it's arguable that the conditions up to and including the Troubles was a pogrom. That's what historian Michael McCann suggests in his book Burnt Out. That the unionist forces, backed by the British government, organised in mobs, supported by the Royal Unionist Constabulary, and spurred on by the inflammatory speeches by figures like the Reverend Ian Paisley, were engaged in a violent riot with the aim of massacring or expelling the Irish-identifying Catholics. It's also arguable that the Irish Republicans were engaged in a fruitless insurrection, that there really would have been peace if they just put down their bombs and guns and gone to work, and accepted that the ruling class is the ruling class no matter what their accent. It's not as if the Republic of Ireland down south escaped class, escaped hierarchies, escaped injustice. That the pointed principle had been eclipsed by the need for compromise. That their actions cost not only the unnecessary spilling of their own blood, but the unnecessary detonation of bombs in London, in Belfast, in Omagh.
I don't know exactly when or how the narrative changed. Only that there is still some romance to the idea that we fought, that whatever we were doing was right, that we were winning. And that, I think, was the handle, that sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. We had all the momentum.
We were riding
the crest of a high and beautiful wave. But now, all these years later, you can look to West Belfast, and with the right kind of eyes you can almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back.
I mean, what do you think? Fascist pogrom or violent thuggery? I certainly have my suspicions that the sort of contemporary member of the IRA would scare the absolute shit out of me, like macho, monomaniacal, capable of violence. But it is also true that high-profile Protestant unionists like Ian Paisley pretty much called for the extermination of Catholics, as well as advocating for such delightful causes as saving Ulster from sodomy. I can also point out here that I was raised Catholic in Ireland, and so I can't be objective or at a remove when I'm telling you about someone who said things like this. This guy would go on to become leader of the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland and serve as First Minister in the Houses of fucking Parliament.
Decent!
Maybe I shouldn't be emphasizing people like him. Maybe I'm editing as I go. This is the trouble with history. It has no objective bystanders. Well, let me try one more time. Instead, we're going to focus on not the socially conservative views, but the economic side of unionism. The United Kingdom is a very wealthy country. The infrastructure in Northern Ireland is demonstrably more consistent and sophisticated than that of the Republic. They have the NHS, one of the best free healthcare systems in the world. They have the BBC, they have the pound sterling.
I'm Greg's.
Northern Ireland allying itself with the UK in a pragmatic economic way is often, I think, how the argument is presented to the British public, particularly to the British public in the big island next door. But here is a taste of the British perception of Northern Ireland.
I do think the Irish are just making trouble because they lost. It's a bit pessy, isn't it? Really?
To really solve the problem and what would be in everyone's interest is if Ireland left.
Yeah, the Southern Irish have to lump it, basically. You can't always have what you want in life.
Contemporary political issues are disseminated to us through the media, and one of the most powerful and reputable forces in the world of media is the British Broadcasting Corporation. Even crazy queer leftists will advocate for the BBC as some kind of reliable news source. But you can turn to more reputable sources, somewhere like the BBC. That's embarrassing. It's safe to say that the British voice is louder and more coherent in the international community than the Irish voice, and it always has been. But their power doesn't derive from their perceived rationality and objectivity. No, the perception of their rationality and objectivity derives from their power. This is an empire with a bloodthirsty history. And although I would love to give you a nuanced perspective on all of the good and bad and in between of the BBC, I'm afraid that would have to be its own essay. Ethnic cleansing or economic union? Terrorists or freedom fighters? Refugees or... Sarah?
Yeah?
Refugees or
Oh, right.
yeah,
right,
the
right,
the
right,
refugees
right.
bit.
Okay, so I'm not a historian. I've never studied history, and a lot of this is beyond my scope. I have been project manager on research specifically about refugees though, but it's also hard not to disintegrate here into a flurry of definitions. What's a state? What's a refugee? What's an internally displaced person? And honestly, conflict scenarios are precisely where those definitions get sort of fuzzy. So this is oversimplified. There are your grains of salt. Neil, we should have used that in an episode where we were cooking. Grains of salt.
Right.
Anyway, when states are determining who qualifies as a refugee, they usually cite the original 1951 definition from the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. It's long and self-referential and complicated. As always, we have our references in the description, so if you want to look at it yourself, it's there. But for now, let's just say the broad strokes of the matter are that a refugee is a person who has crossed a national boundary out of fear of persecution. The UNHCR, one of the two branches of the UN who supports refugees, the other being UNRWA, which exclusively deals with Palestinian refugees, which is complicated and off track. Sorry. Northern Ireland. The UNHCR has a second definition for internally displaced people. Those are people who have had to leave their homes due to persecution or violence or fear, but haven't actually crossed a national boundary. And they're also under the purview of the UNHCR. So there are terms and there are players. Let's go to the important question. Were there Northern Irish refugees? Well, between 45,000 and 60,000 people fled their homes as a result of the Troubles. This was the largest movement of people since World War II. So given the official reality on the island, those who relocated to other parts of Northern Ireland should be considered internally displaced people. And those who crossed the border between the United Kingdom and the Republic should be considered refugees, approximately 11,000 people. And for the first few years of this, they were considered refugees, at least by the Irish. Irish army camps opened army refugee centres. The Irish Red Cross stepped up to help northern refugees. But it's funny because around 1971, the Republic largely stopped calling them refugees in any official manner. And now we don't really think of them as refugees anymore. The Republic established something called the Remembrance Commission in 2003 in order to give financial aid to those who had been victims of the Troubles. But the wording of the commission skirts the more loaded terms like refugee or IDP and instead refers to displacement. See, it's political when you call someone a refugee. There's a distinct difference between, for example, saying Palestinian refugee or Palestine refugee. One of those is broadly accepted and the other is very controversial. It gets controversial when you have an island, which sometimes is considered one country and sometimes another, which allows free movement but which requires foreigners like me to carry a passport in some sections and my Irish residence card in others. The special relationship between the two places, the vague compromise between what this region actually is, makes it hard to cling to one specific narrative in order to use words like refugee. Like, right now, if you're born here, you can either get Irish or British citizenship. There are these sort of dual realities living simultaneously in a weird compromise. And if you say refugee or IDP, you might be picking one side over the other. I think there's another part to this too. I think we've got this very particular narrative around refugees. We came up with the official criteria and definitions after World War II, where the good guys were the Americans and the Brits. And I just don't know if that definition easily fits onto people who are fleeing from violence in the US or the UK. Not that there's anything in the wording of the convention that would preclude it, there isn't. And not even because there would be serious political consequences, though there would be. But if we're on the receiving end of a lifetime of propaganda about who the good guys are, how can we conceive that the good guys are creating climates where people are unsafe just being who they are? Kyle Liddell Canty, a US citizen, applied for asylum in Canada on the basis of being Black and having a reasonable fear of police brutality. The UNHCR refugee definition demands that the applicant have a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. In his application, Canty cited Mike Brown and Derek Gardner and documented cases of personal harassment from police officers who had charged him with petty offenses like jaywalking or trespassing when he was using free Wi-Fi at a bus station. Canty was able to present evidence that Black people experience a disproportionate amount of police brutality, coming from sources like the UN. Still, Canty's application was denied in 2016. It's funny, again, for this episode, I read a number of UNHCR reports, and I was struck particularly by the 2015 report on the LGBT plus refugees. That one was really resonant for me as a queer person. It acknowledged, for example, that even in places where there aren't direct and overt laws against being queer, there can still be a pervasive aura of threat. And obviously, that's damaging. And obviously, someone should have the ability to leave a country that makes them feel that way. But I just don't think we'd accept a refugee from the UK who is fleeing on the basis of transphobia, even though the discrimination there is both daily life and in legislature. I just don't know that we can square all the rainbow capitalism and greatest country narratives with the reality of a place where someone would have a well-founded fear of persecution for membership in a particular social group, like being trans in the UK. Right, Neil? Neil?
Where are you taking me, Thatcher?
To where you can do no more damage.
Don't start with me!
I did not start with you. You started with me. You started this crusade with your mind already made up about the British. I had no such prejudices about the Irish.
Ha! When Peter Mandelson was appointed as Secretary for Northern Ireland, Margaret Thatcher said to him, "You can't trust the Irish. They're all liars."
And you read that in an Irish newspaper, did you? Tell me, do you agree with Irish newspapers when they tell you what you don't like to hear?
We all know you were an old, colonial, classist bastard who despised the Irish.
I always cheer up immensely if an attack is particularly wounding because I think, well, if they attack one personally, it means they have not a single political argument left.
As Prime Minister, your actions directly inflamed the whole conflict in Northern Ireland and you didn't care. You liked it.
I was the target of an IRA bombing in 1984. It was not reasonable nor necessary nor prudent to be pacifistic.
What was it you said? When Bobby Sands died from his hunger strike, Mr. Sands was a convicted criminal. He chose to take his own life. It was a choice his organization did not allow many of its victims.
You are using drama and emotion to radicalize. It's dreadfully irresponsible and frankly dangerous. You and I both know that I'm floating in the sky simply as a target of vitriol. The relevance of my role in all this is quite incidental. Your argument consists of being a nicer person than me.
I don't care! You can't be rational about Northern Ireland, not anymore! It is an emotional issue! Whether or not you were a colonial monster is relevant! This isn't even what the essay's supposed to be about! Let people decide for themselves, forget about the politics! I want to talk about discourse and language! I'm just trying to get something said!
If you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman.
Well, I'm neither!
Of course, I'm desperately holding on to my honor. Perception of the words as if there is an escape from the social construct of war written by the British Navy doesn't change something right. It doesn't have to be supposed to commit to a revolution without its people
Fuck. Alright, well, forget all of that. That's not gonna get anything done. Okay, it's fun. I can't help it. I love that shit. And consciousness raising really matters. Check out this video by Marxist Paul for more on that. But essentially all that yelling at right-wingers is just an attempt at catharsis. All that trying to construct the perfect argument in the shower against Geordie B. PDB or Bean Shart or Thargert Matcher is just a reflexive urge to flex, and it delivers nothing. Here's what you can do. The Enough is Enough protests in the UK are breaking records for protests and for support for protest in that country. If there was an election tomorrow, the Tories would be decimated. The support for Scottish independence is growing as we speak towards its peak and hopefully beyond, despite how the British media might spin the poll even up to our own flippin' citation on the matter, which says two things. It could happen, but it needs your help to happen. Support politicians like Mary Black, an absolute grassroots legend that I really recommend you just watch clips of if you want to be reassured that politicians can in fact be good people.
The priority isn't the economy, it seems to be things like protecting freedom of speech, and yet the Tories are the ones that have banned schools in England from using sources that are not overtly pro-capitalist.
There's a small publication here in Ireland, The Ditch, and they're doing amazing work holding to account corrupt politicians. At time of recording, they are potentially on corrupt politician number 3, whose resignation they might cause. They need your financial support. Fine Gael, the right-leaning centrist neoliberal bullshit party that's been mostly running Ireland for the last 12 years, is polling at 19%. The signs are that they would also be decimated in a general election. Our Socialist Party, People Before Profit, are actively recruiting members. They need your support. Left-wing politicians like Paul Murphy could use your support. Even just moral support on Twitter. His replies are full of the sort of centrist dads that talk out their arses. One of the most palpable examples of the mindset of status quo defenders who grew up in this rewritten history. Support Paul Murphy, Sinn Féin, Mick Lynch, Mary Black, Jeremy Corbyn, Tories out, Fine Gael out, vote left, transfer left, if that's your electoral system. Across Europe, there is a left-wing swing, except in Italy, and also it's complicated. As we can see in the UK, this push for anti-protest laws, anti-trans and anti-immigration laws, and a culture that foments fascism. The time is now. The time is now for fighting. Just like in Northern Ireland, where the democratic majority of right-leaning royalists was a construction, a falsehood, and now the numbers demonstrate a population that cares less about Catholicism and Protestantism and more about economic prosperity and peace. that voted against leaving the EU, and although Irish reunification doesn't appear to be something that the majority of Northern Irish people want at present, a vote to decide is something that the majority of people want across both sides of the border. Maybe more Northern Irish folk would trust the Republic of Ireland with their fate if we weren't such a corrupt little tax haven, ignoring the northern counties that we have, giving not a shit about infrastructure outside of building hotels in Dublin and decimating our working class. Maybe under new leadership with some radical politics, we might be able to offer the people of the North something more than just an imposed idea of historical catharsis. For all the poetic references to Hunter S. Thompson in this essay, I'm not particularly convinced by vague poetry. I'm more interested in pragmatic action. Since we originally produced this doomed video, the UK government has gone through several prime ministers, taken an unprecedented step in blocking the Scottish gender recognition reform, plans to ban images in the media showing refugees on boats in a positive light, and just in general, has shown itself to be the global embarrassment of inequality and evil that it always was, but it was a bit better for a while, and it used to have a better quality of life, and Tony Blair made it look swish. And Northern Ireland has been white-knuckling through this downturn in the quality of British economic kayfabe. The North had already had most of its cultural peculiarities ironed out by money. 90s-style neoliberalism was the carrot that brought peace, and the past violence was the stick. Now the UK uses the tacit threat of borders and economic instability to keep Scotland in its place, which is pretty rich, coming from the place that did a big, ugly pratfall into Brexit, against the wishes of the people of Scotland and Northern Ireland. But we're going in circles. The point is, grassroots political movements happen first. Leadership change, big left-wing push, face off against the fascists on the streets, be they state-sanctioned or just pure hate-filled gammon. Vote with and use your dollar or your pound or your euro, and as always, ought implies can, so please take care of yourself in all of this. The violence in Northern Ireland was a culture war, a class war, and that class war rages on across new and diffuse borders. There will be no historical justice, no admission of wrongdoing, no catharsis, as is the case across all the colonized world. But there may still be a kind of justice at this historically unique moment when the streets are full of protest and the conservative establishment, though powerful, he's unpopular. Don't give up. Put your energy, your money, your imagination, and your heart, and whatever you have, wherever you can. Americans, Canadians, Australians, you sit on stolen land in your own Northern Irelands. You know who you must support. And it happens to be exactly those trying to save you from climate catastrophe. Those that are left-wing are largely those that have been oppressed and those supporting rewilding, degrowth, and wealth equality. Those that your establishment has written off as already gone, as parody, as subhuman, through your own colonizer brainwashing and culture. But don't give up. Reimagine. There may be a little shameful orgasm, a petit mort of catharsis in telling old Thatcher she was a bastard, or imagining punching Rishi Sunak in his fucking teeth, or whoever or whatever. But a socialist movement on these islands, such that those who are disadvantaged may survive and thrive, now that could be real catharsis. So what is Northern Ireland? It's a country, it's legitimate, it has awesome people and places in it, and I am far more concerned with what happens to them than I am about pretty much anything else. No borders, no kings, no shouting at the sky, only justice. And hey, British Museum, give us our fucking shit back, you fucking shameless posh wankers.
yourself to swallow. Take those feelings down. Compost for the flowers growing from the ground. 'Cause grieving isn't easy, and it's harder in this town. And I told you I was happy, and I meant it in my way. I meant to make it clear that I was grateful for your face. I held you in your silence, and I saw the empty space. I noticed every moment till the moments went away.
Hello there.
Actually, editor, sorry. This already happened because we released this video in the past.
Right.
So then you offer Rob the opportunity to be a leftist cook, and then we go on that adventure through the multiverse?
Uh-huh.
So if we can just skip over all of that to now, because I really want to talk to you about something important.
Ooh. Do I get to be a
good guy?
Dare I say, an ally?
Yeah, sure. Because you see, it's not irrelevant that this all happened in the past and now this is happening now, because I'm worried about the future. And what do you know about time paradoxes?